Good afternoon, Senators. The Committee in the Whole is now back in session. I would like to recognize the presence of Speaker Cruz and Senator Torres and Senator Will Castro. We do still have the representatives from the Port Authority of Guam. I will suspend discussion for another 5 to 10 minutes, and as we await for the other senators, we've received notices that they are en route. So we will recess for another 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, Senators. The Committee in the Whole is now reconvened. Just so that I appropriately recognize the Senators who are presently here. We have Speaker Cruz, Vice Speaker Talahi, Senator Regine Bisco-Lee, Senator Tom Ada, Senator Will Castro, Senator Tilanda Nelson, Senator Luis Muñoz, Senator Jim Espardan, and Senator Mary Torres. Thank you, Senators, for joining us again in this Committee in the Whole. When we left, Senator Regine Bisco-Lee was going to commence her discussion as well as any line of questions that she would like to pose to members of the panel on the proposed legislation. Senator Lee, you're recognized.
Situs Masi, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for participating in this Committee of the Whole discussion. I do want to reiterate some of the concerns that were raised at the public hearing and also by a number of my colleagues with regard to what people are worried about would be a bailout of recent port litigation. And I know that's been dispelled by you, Madam General Manager, and your team. But we've also taken it upon ourselves to file an amicus brief and really focus on protecting our stance on sovereign immunity in this body. I just wanted, and maybe there will be an amendment forthcoming that will help us to just ensure that this money will not be used to settle litigation or pay any attorney's fees and the like. And I know that that's been raised at the public hearing and you've responded to some of my colleagues, but I just wanted to reiterate my concern for that. In addition to that, on page 45 of the bill, in section 3, it details financing certain authority capital improvements included but not limited to, and then it goes on to describe a number of different things that we'd be funding. And first, it describes a local match for the Tiger Grant. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe update colleagues of mine who might not have been at the public hearing about the Tiger Grant. And I wanted an opportunity to kind of discuss, we're talking about $14.2 million of the local match, but I wanted to talk have you guys talk a little bit about a brief history and maybe the total grant number and what the port would be receiving in terms of this Tiger Grant.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Brown?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Senator Bisco-Lee, for your inquiry. Last year in 2016, the Port of Guam received a $10 million Tiger Grant. We were only one of 6 ports in the entire nation to receive this funding. There's only $66 million specifically provided for ports. The rest, over $500 million, was provided for other types of transportation services for rail, roadways, and things of that nature. It's not the first time. I think it's like the second or third time the port specifically applied for Tiger for H-Wharf. And we refer to it as H-Wharf because back in Department of Transportation, they kind of think we're doing something like touristy related, and we have to clarify that that's actually the name that was given to the wharf at the time, the former Navy Ammunitions Wharf. With the $10 million, our share collectively is about $14.2 million. It's an estimated $24 million plus that will be needed to essentially refurbish that wharf. Back in the 1980s, that wharf was transferred from the U.S. Navy as a former ammunition wharf. Once Kilo Wharf was constructed, they transferred their operations and turned over H-Wharf to the Port of Guam. For goodness now, getting on 15, 16 years, there's really been no active activity in terms of the use. Right now, it's not authorized by the U.S. Coast Guard for the transfer of property. Occasionally, we have barges and vessels that might actually come along the pier, but we have no ability legally to transfer cargo to or from H-Wharf to a vessel or from a vessel to H-Wharf. So sometimes we have chassis parked there. We have some refurbishment work being done on vessels there. But in terms of the critical need as an active wharf in operation, we do not have that availability now. We also do not have the flexibility to be able to use it. In the event, for whatever reason, something may happen to our main wharfs in the yard that have our cranes, we don't have an alternate wharf to go to. And that's one of the major advantages. I know, Senator Castro, you went down there recently and toured our facilities. That particular wharf, once it is refurbished, the intent is to turn it into a multi-use facility so that any vessel that has its own crane gear or ship's gear that doesn't require the use of our cranes could operate there. Ro-ro vessels where they drive vehicles and trucks and things of that nature off the vessel, they could actually also come in through there. I know there's a lot of interest in the tourism industry about expanding our cruise industry. And in the interim, until perhaps maybe they might want to build something down here in Agana, our cruise ships can be very easily accommodated at that location so that it doesn't impact, because right now, while cruise ships is a very positive thing in bringing more tourists into the island, it actually impacts our commercial operations in the yard because we do have to meet standards and requirements by the U.S. Coast Guard. We actually have to cordon a large section of our wharf off. And because of the old laws, cruise ships still have priority, because back in the day when that was a major form of transportation, they were prioritized over commercial vessels. And that still exists today, even though the world has changed and pretty much people travel for recreational vacation purposes, not essential because they have no other form of transportation. But commercial vessels have to wait in line, so to speak, until that cruise ship clears. So being able to bring them in at H-Wharf will make it more accessible. They don't have that long walk that they need to do. It doesn't impact our regular day-to-day operations in the commercial yard. Commercial activity can continue, and yet at the same time we can still accommodate our visitors and bring them into a very much more, I guess, attractive environment, even though they have to drive down Route 11. They're not having to walk through a commercial yard, which is what the kind of reception that they get coming into the island now. So being able to refurbish that wharf and get it fully operational, getting it re-permitted by the U.S. Coast Guard would be a tremendous asset for the port. And it's also backup, even though the military spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the last few years to refurbish all the wharfs down at Naval Station. This still, again, provides them an alternate should the need be there in times of emergency. And also, even though we are now identified as a strategic port, we've had a slightly modified title, but nevertheless, we're still required, should the U.S. military require the use of our facilities, we have to provide them up to 1,000 feet of wharf space within 24 hours, and H-Wharf can accommodate half of that capacity if needed. So I think there's nothing but pluses of what can be gained to get this wharf facility back in operation, and to have $10 million federal dollars to help contribute to that process would be very beneficial. We just had Merit out here 2 months ago, actually to tour the facilities and go over the requirements that we need to have in place in order to formalize our agreement with them so that we can commence with the repairs, certainly once we identify our share of the Tiger grant.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to clarify, for the federal portion of the Tiger grant is a $10 million contribution? That's the total?
It's 10 million, yes. It's 10 million, yes.
Okay, so 10 million from them and then 14.2 from us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Anyone else have questions or comments? Senator Tom Atta, Senator Luis Muña, Senator Mary Torres. Senator Atta, you're recognized.
On Hotel Wharf, so the grant was for 10 million, and we need to match that. So why are we asking for 14?
At the end of the day, that's the estimated cost for the actual full repair. 10 million is what they were able to provide for us in terms of their contribution to that, and that's why we have the difference of the additional 4 million on our part. Certainly, we're not ultimately going to know what the cost is going to be to refurbish Hotel Wharf until the project goes out to bid. So we're going on an engineering estimate that that's what it will cost at this time. It may cost more, it may cost less, of course, depending on, the companies and the worker issues that we're currently facing, what that ultimately, bottom dollar will be. But that's why you see the slight difference of the 4 million versus, 10 million their share and our 50% share of 10 million.
Okay. On Section 3, page 45, an amount was attached to each project. So for Hotel Wharf, 14.2 million will be allocated for that project. For the administration building, 17.5 million, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just concerned about attaching a value to each project, as opposed to saying we authorize $80 million to do these projects, because then, as written, what would happen is if we estimate that replacement of the administration building is going to cost 17.5 million, and the bids come in at 18, you're stuck. As opposed, and it may be that Hotel Wharf may come in at a lot lower amount, and so you could easily then shuffle that money around. So, Mr. Chairman, the amendment that can we make amendments now?
I will entertain amendments, yes.
So the amendment that I would make is to just remove the dollar amount, and what's really important is the operative word. For example, for the administration building, the operative word is to replace it. For the EQMR building, it's to repair. However much that costs, you can do all of this. If you can do it all for 80 million, then you're good. So that would be my amendment for items 1A, B, C, D, E, and F.
Thank you very much, Senator Atta. Senators, there's an amendment being proffered by Senator Atta in Section 3 to remove the numerical number associated with each of the projects. So, for example, on page 45, line 25, remove $14.2 million and in conjunction with that, the appropriate language. For example, line 24, for rehabilitation of H-Wharf, and then period, an access road, then period, in the approximate amount of. So the associated language with that figure, Senator Atta, is that correct?
Yeah, so,
okay.
So for example, page 45, then line 24 will read of rehabilitation of H-Wharf and access road, period.
Okay. Okay, Senators, do we understand the amendment? The amendment is to delete the numerical number and the associated language for each sub-item. Sub-item A, in the approximate amount of $14.2 million. Sub-item B, likewise, building, period, in the approximate amount of $17.5 million. Line 2 on page 46, relocation of water lines, period. Then deletion of the approximate amount of $6 million. Line 4, same page, EQMR, period. Delete the subsequent language. Line 5 and 6, repair of warehouse 1, period. And then delete the subsequent language. Line 7, repair of golf pier, period. And then delete the subsequent language in that sentence.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what we're looking at with the amendment by Senator Atta. Any questions or discussion?
Mr. Chair.
All those in favor?
I have.
Okay, Senator Nelson, you're recognized on the proposed amendment.
So what we're trying to do here is, just a question, what we're trying to do here is, we're still capping it at $65 million, and instead of doing a line item per project, we're going to give them a full blanket of $65 million so that they have the ability to shuffle the money around per project. So, which is going to say that right now we don't think that their projections are accurate. Is that what we're saying?
Senator Nelson, I'll have the mover of the amendment respond. Senator Atta, would you like to yield?
So what we're trying to do is provide the port with maximum flexibility to move money around. I think all we really need to do at our level here is to authorize them and provide a cap, 65 million, 80, whatever it is. This is, you can't go out and borrow more than that. To do the following projects, project A, B, C, and D. What they don't have control of is how much the bids will come into. So if we box them in and say you can only spend 17 million for the replacement of the administration building, if the bids come in at 17.5, 18 million, then they're kind of stuck and they're going to have to scale back then. But you know, that's not to say that I think that maybe the estimates are probably accurate enough, but may not be precise. And so as a result, it just gives them difficulty that's really not necessary.
Thank you, Senator Atta. Senator Nelson, you still have the floor.
Well, because the administration building was mentioned to be replaced at the amount of $17.5 million. In the public hearing, it wasn't really clear if there was a plan in place or even a blueprint of what the administration building would look like. And so I want to ask, perhaps, before we entertain this amendment, this is a significant amendment. Before we entertain it, I want to ask, perhaps, how did you come to the $17.5 million? And then, do you have a design for the administration building, or is it just a number rounded out per square footage? It still wasn't really clear, because I'm thinking, if I want to build a house, I'm going to know how much it's going to cost my house. I'm not just saying, oh, I want the square footage, because you have to consider everything else that goes inside that house. And so where did this come from, and how much? Because just to also, and another caveat to that is, doesn't the administration building also, or used to hold Matson tenants? Is that the same building? And so I'm understanding that you guys are also renting pieces of that real estate within the building to certain businesses. So what kind of revenue do you receive from that? Because, I mean, it was unclear how much it was going to cost. It was very clear that there was no plan in place on what the building would look like. And so I want to see if since then, is there something that we can go by that's a little bit more concrete?
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Senator Brown, there's a twofold question. Is how did you come up with your $17.5 million initially, and then the rental that the facility is providing to some of your stakeholders?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you, Senator Nelson, for your question. I guess this is a challenge, because this is what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I mean, in order to begin the process of even doing the design, we're estimating what our current square footage is. We're estimating what the potential size of the building will be based on what we're currently looking at the formula for per square footage for commercial construction, which is on or around $350, which may increase depending, of course, on what happens with our worker issue. At the end of the day, this is the amount we've identified in relation to that, because actually the port itself, the port operations, would only maybe grow by 6,000 square feet from its existing operations now. Our current admin building is about 25,000 square feet. Close to 30% of that is occupied by tenants that are all in the marine transportation industry that do lease property from us. The previous office space that Matson has occupied has since been taken over by APL, who returned to the island a couple of years ago, so they are leasing out that property. Our hope is, with the construction of the new admin building, close to 40% of that property actually will be used also for our commercial tenants, primarily due to their request and their demand for additional space, and they have asked for that additional space. It's not my place to speak for Matson. They do have a beautiful building. I think that building, with the property acquisition, they publicly stated has cost them close to $9 million. And that's a nice building, but it's not a very big building where you think you're going to have port operations plus commercial tenants. But that's what we looked at. We looked at what the estimated cost could be for a certain square footage. Of course, you have to consider the infrastructure connections, what it's going to cost us to get our whole IT moved over and set up and all those other things. But it gives us a general parameter upon which we can design a building closest as possible to that cost. We went and looked at the GPA-GWA facility. That cost over $30 million. It's quite sizable. It's a beautiful facility. But I don't think, in terms of port in particular, we're looking at anything that large. I mean, you've got two utilities that are combined there. And in their case, I understand they also had to address the acquisition of the property, which we do not. And so that's what we're looking at. If that's the give or take the amount that we have closest to in order to design the building, that gives us the parameters on estimating what the going rate per square footage is and what our needs are. I would look to the future, though, that when we do site the building, we've discussed this, of actually making sure we have property that is usable adjacent to that building. So down the road, if there is a need to further expand, be it for the operations of the port, or perhaps our commercial tenants need to expand as well, that opportunity is there down the road, perhaps when additional revenue may be available to fund further expansion. But for the port itself, 6,000 square feet is not that big a building. I mean, that's maybe 2 or 3 standard houses put together. That's not a very big physical extension for the port operations itself. But that's how we've come about it in terms of getting an estimate, because we had to come up with an estimated cost.
Yes, thank you for that. So 6,000 square feet, and the appropriated amount is 17.5, and you said that it's just about the cost of three homes, and you're absolutely right.
In terms of the space,
the size.
additional space to the actual
Right.
port operations, and that's also hopefully including additional conference rooms. We don't have anything in the main building to accommodate that. Right now, we use the boardroom, or occasionally we use the Port Command Center, which in general, we should not be using that for public meetings
But the
because of
size
the need to secure the facility. But we don't have meeting rooms. We don't have little meeting rooms, for example, also even within the divisions if they're meeting with clients.
But the size is still 6,000 square feet.
I'm saying that the additional, to the port itself, the additional space beyond that, the 40 plus combined, is going to go to commercial tenants. And we did mention, we were asked that question by the Speaker's office, how much are we looking up to? And we're looking up to perhaps 40% to also include the requests from our tenants for meeting space. They would like to have a place where they can convene meetings, or if they have trainings, that they would have a facility there in the building that they could use for that purpose, because they don't have that. We have more demand right now for space than we have space available to provide.
So how large is the building going to be?
I think we're estimating, what, it was over 40,000 square feet? About 40,000 square feet. It's an
40,000.
additional 15, give or take.
40,000. And how much do you receive in revenue from your rentals? Because you said it makes 30%. You bring it up to
Alfred
30.
would give you that figure.
Thank you.
Currently, our annual rental from our commercial tenants is about $158,000. We anticipate in the new building to double our square footage available to the commercial tenants, and
Sir, can you please speak into the microphone? Yeah, just bring it closer to you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Right now, our rental is $158,000, and it's based on approximately 7,500 square foot of leased space. When we go into the new building, we anticipate to double the square footage for the commercial tenants. The rent is fixed by law per square foot, which is $1.79 per square foot. And that's how much we would charge in the old building. It's the same amount we'll charge in the new building until such time as our 5-year renewal or appraisal of the value of the property occurs.
So there is there a blueprint of a designed building in place, or no?
We don't have blueprints of the building. I mean, in order to do that, that's going to require substantial funding. We don't have that authorized by our board yet. We actually put up $500,000 just to do the design work on H-Wharf, primarily because we were applying for the Tiger Grant. And the Tiger Grant does require that the project has to be shovel-ready in order to be eligible for consideration. But no, we have not. We're hoping through the process of getting the bond funding that we would get the funding that we need to actually go out there and do an architectural design of the building.
Senator Nelson, before we get into the design of the new admin building, we have to determine which of the 2 sites that would be the possible location of the new admin building. We have to determine the engineering studies to see which side is more conducive to building a building. And then once we determine the engineering specifications of it in terms of the weight, size, and everything else that property can hold, at that point in time, we would be able to come up with a conceptual drawing and architectural work based on the engineering study. But the engineering study is a priority before we get into the architectural work.
Senator Nelson?
I really don't want to come off being rude or disrespectful, but it seems that that there's very little planning in this request for $17.5 million. There's an engineering study involved. You don't know where the building's going to be placed. We don't know a hard number of how much it's going to cost. So my question is why is the appropriation for a number that we're guessing when when we should be appropriating first the build.
Well, we are not guessing. What we're doing is putting a ceiling on how much we plan to spend on the building, just like anything
But
else.
it's an unknown.
Well,
And which is why Senator Ada is making the amendment.
Even though it's unknown, that's the maximum we plan on spending on the building, even if it means scaling down the size of the building.
Yeah.
And that's important that you mentioned that because you're looking to increase your rental space to 40%. So if you're going to scale down,
Senator, I think you're getting into semantics. I mean,
No,
please allow me to respond.
Definitely not semantics.
You've asked us a
I'm just
question.
trying to understand.
We just want to respond. Let me just take you through this process because
Senator Brown, I understand. It's Senator Nelson has the floor. So
well, then,
please,
if
we
you
can
want to
yield
let us
her.
know when you want us to respond, we'd be happy to do so.
If she would like you to respond.
I'm
Senator
just-
No
Nelson?
problem with the dialogue.
I'm trying to understand the 17.5 when there's no design, there's no location of where the building is going to be, but you're estimating that it's going to be 17.5. That's the only concern that I have.
Okay.
And so I'm saying that instead of awarding or appropriating 17.5, why don't we just appropriate what it's going to cost for the design and whatever other tests that you need to solidify, so then we have a more concrete number. So we're not going by an unknown. That's all. It's not
Senator
about
Nelson,
semantics.
Did you want Senator Brown to respond?
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Brown?
I just want to clarify because I understand where you're coming from. At the same time, I don't know when we do major construction for the government of Guam, including the new schools that we have had built, when we have had the design plans before us and approved them in order to fund them. In order to venture down this bond, we're trying to identify the most critical issues that we need to fund moving forward for the next few years because we are locking up our ability to borrow in order to accommodate these projects. The relocation of the admin building is absolutely critical because in order to expand our maintenance capability, which we must do so, for those of you that have been down there, you've seen the size of the equipment and the amount of space. I maybe could barely squeeze 2 top lifters in this room and safely maneuver it, assuming that the doors were big enough to accommodate that. We've recently acquired 4. We will be acquiring with the remaining $50 million. There's $2.4 million that Merit has identified that we can purchase additional equipment out of that. We have to have some place to maintain that equipment. We have to have some place to store it. The admin the facility down there for maintenance has been the exact same space for 50 years. So aside from having a new building, there's not too much other footprint there in terms of property that we can expand other than to take over the admin facility parking lot and the admin facility building. The adjacent properties across where Cabris is and the fisheries facility are in long-term leases that were entered into back in the late 60s, and I think there's another 40 plus years on those leases. So we can't expand into those, we can't like cancel those leases and expand into those properties. What we can do is provide you an estimate, and as was mentioned, we can only live within the ceiling of that. If there's a difference, give or take, maybe the port through its revenues might be able to adjust, but we can only build what you're authorizing. In order to execute the bond, I don't know any other way, Senator, because we need to get the money to begin the process. If you're only going to limit us to design and then come back maybe a year or 2 from now and then you're going to authorize funding, we're going to do another bond execution. Every time you go to do a bond, you have to pay all the fees that are attached to that, and we're going to pay probably just as much because we're going through the same motions. The only thing that's different is the exact amount of the bond itself. So that's why we need that process to be able to have funds so that we can begin the design. These things are not insurmountable. Identifying of the 2 properties, which is the most conducive, long-term, we need to look also eventual expansion of the port, which of those properties are more critical for eventual expansion, because every 20 to 30 years we have seen the expansion of the yard out. And there's only so much property left between where the new yard ends and, for example, the Cabris GPA facility begins in order to be able to expand, assuming F7 down the road ever gets built. So those are things, they're not insurmountable. The engineering designs that need to be put in place, the soil testing that needs to be done, those things obviously are not insurmountable. They happen all the time. They can be executed. And we design a building to what we can afford. If we have to adjust certain things because this is a ceiling that we have, then that's what we have to do. But to simply say we're not going to do it because we don't have design, those things are not out in the space, they're not out in space. They can be done. They're not impossible to do. We just simply have to have the funds to move forward, to get the design work done, to specify out of the two locations which is the most feasible, and then move forward from there. And as I mentioned, if down the road the port has additional resources and there's a need for additional space for be it commercial use or the port itself has to expand, then the adjacent property will be there so that they can do so when they have the funds. But I have to tell you, in all my years here, I've never seen the design plans or blueprints for the construction of a new GovQuan facility. In most cases, it's a conceptual idea of what the estimated costs will be, and then we simply have to live within the framework of what those funds are.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Nelson.
Thank you. Well, I have seen some projects that have a design and concept that for build, and so that's why I'm asking in my short time here. And it's not, you're absolutely right, it's not insurmountable, which is why I'm asking basically why has it not been done. And I'm not saying that just because it's not done, that's all that there should be appropriated. Absolutely not. I'm saying that there must be a level of accountability. That's all.
And Senator, I have to tell you, I have no problem with it. I
you,
understand, Senator, but I think the impression that somehow we're not, you know, you approved
Senator
the bond
Brown,
for the airport. I mean, did you ask for the design on the layout of the tarmac? I'm sorry, I'm dumbfounded.
Senator Nelson, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to object the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Vice Speaker Talai, on the amendment to remove the numerical numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the prior discussion because this, some of this was discussed at the public hearing, and sorry, I just had it. Just give me 1 second. Admin. Here it is. And one of the questions that the speaker had sent to the port before he reported the bill out was he had asked for a cost-benefit analysis of the proposed new administration building or any other contemplated alternatives. And the port's response on page 9 of 11 was, the port developed an estimated cost of construction for the administration building showing 4 options, monetizing replacement versus repair. The benefit portion of the analysis is currently being developed and will be submitted upon completion. And then they go on to talk about findings for constructing a new 40,000 square foot administration building. In another correspondence with the speaker, I believe, item number 4, page 404, the port was asked, what is the proportion of the floor space to be dedicated to commercial tenants? And the port's response was, the existing administration building sits on a 25,400 square foot print. Of that space, 30% is occupied by commercial tenants in the maritime industry. This translates to 7,620 square feet dedicated to the port's business partners. Since the proposal is to build a new 40,000 square foot building, the port is planning to increase available tenant space up to 40% to include meeting and conference room space. With all due respect, I would also object to the amendment, and because I agree with the, sorry, Mr. Duenas, are you the CFO of the port, that I don't know, I feel like it's our responsibility as government policy makers to set the policy here and to set the caps. Because it seems to me from what's been said already this morning that the timing of this may not be the best, right? I mean, we're looking at things changing in Congress that might absolutely increase the cost of this borrowing compared to perhaps a few years ago. So I think we should always, be looking at the big picture and make sure that if we say to the public, we're going to allow borrowing in a certain amount and we're going to get all of these things out of it, if we're not able to get those things out of it, then maybe we need to come back, right? If they find that it's impossible for them to live within these caps, then that's cause for concern, I would think, for all of us as policymakers and for the public, that they should know that, building perhaps the administration building is way more than we ever expected, right? Because of things beyond your control. I agree, right? The things you cited earlier, the workforce issues and the tax issues that are being discussed in Congress. So I was actually going to ask that we tighten the language instead of removing the caps altogether, to tighten it so that we say, instead of approximate amount of, that we say up to. So those are very strict caps. And it does. It forces accountability on the part of the port, and also for us. We have to account for allowing all this borrowing for certain purposes, and we need to be sure that we get what we have, you know, we're...
Vice
we
Speaker
can't
Talahi,
forget
are you
that,
proposing an amendment to the amendment?
well, we can't, if I could just finish, Mr. Chair. The caps are important also, I think, because we can't forget that all of this borrowing is not coming out of the air. It's coming out of increased tariffs, that we have increased the rates, or the port has increased the rates with the permission of the PUC, 7% and then 7%. And I wanted to ask, are we in our second year of the 7%? We're still in the first year. So next year, port tariffs are going to increase 7%. That's a given, and that's supposedly to cover borrowing also, right? And so I just think we need to be considerate of the people of Guam who are paying for all this borrowing. And of course, I think they've been, you know, I think we could get more answers to some of these estimated costs, and I don't know. But I just think that if we pass this today, then we should, if we can't get this stuff done for the amounts that are being proposed here, then we should all be forced to come back. So I would ask that, I would object to that motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. Senator St. Nicholas, you have the floor, and then Vice Speaker Cruz on the proposed amendment by Senator Tamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to first put on the record, we actually do have a project that we require an architectural and engineering to be done before the actual authorization for the borrowing, and that was the labor and delivery ward for the Guam Memorial Hospital. As a matter of fact, that was a specific section that I put into that legislation at that time, and it actually resulted in a material difference in the amount that needed to be borrowed when they finished the A&E. So, you know, those are the kind of things I think it may not have been done a lot in the past, but I think it's very healthy for us to be doing going forward. I'd like to commend the retiring speakers because they are absolutely correct. It's better for us to know how much a project costs before we authorize a ceiling, or in the case of this amendment, not have one at all. And it's further telling when, you know, when the federal government requires it for their grants, we're so quick to comply, but we don't want to do it for our local borrowing. You know, I think that we should, and I think that the same resources that we were able to find in order to be able to fund the A&D or whatever it was called at the time for that grant to be awarded should be reprogrammed to fund the admin building. In light of the statements made, I'm just curious too as to the difference of 6,000 square feet for the actual offices of the port versus the difference for the tenants. And is the tenant portion of the difference fully funded by the rents, or is that partially funded by the tariffs? If you can, sir.
It's funded by the tariff.
So we're upgrading the offices of tenants at the cost to the consumers of Guam.
And the new building.
And the
admin portion.
And the admin portion, right. Yes. And you see, even for me, just the admin portion in and of itself is just, at 6,000 square feet, I think that we can probably self-fund that without having to borrow. At 40,000 square feet, for the benefit of tenants to be able to have a much nicer facility that the consumers are going to be paying for higher tariffs, I actually just find that very objectionable. If we're going to do that, we should have the rents pay for it, and if there's some kind of law preventing that from happening, we should probably revisit that law. But I'm just concerned about a $17.5 million figure And then further concerned about just eliminating that ceiling altogether, I would support an amendment to tighten that language. And it's consistent also with the refinancing part too here, because it says refinance all or a portion of the following outstanding loans on page 46, line 9. And that means that we don't have to refinance everything. We could just let that sit and reprogram those dollars that would have gone to those things. So I don't support the idea of less accountability. I very much support the idea of more. I very much support the idea of having the architectural and engineering study done first, maybe doing two. Do one for 6,000 square feet, just the admin offices, and do one tossing in all the tenants and making their places nice. And then, from there, letting the public have an opportunity to speak towards that. But I really don't think the people of Guam would respond too favorably to the idea of knowing that their can of Spam is going to cost more so that a tenant at the port can have a nicer office. That just, So that being said, I agree. We probably do need to tighten the language further instead of making it more flexible. But I'm going to go ahead, Mr. Chairman, and continue to listen to dialogue from our colleagues.
Thank you very much, Senator San Nicolas. We still have an amendment on the floor by Senator Tom Adat. Speaker Cruz, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my concern with deleting the amounts that are there, we really need to put then an amount that's going to be for capital improvement projects. So on line 20, if Finance Authority capital improvement projects, put a cap for that. Otherwise, as the retiring speaker mentioned, the entire 80 million could be used for CIP projects and not refinance any loans. It would seem to me that you would have to tighten up both sections, an amount up to 50 million for CIP projects, and you list them, and it goes in that order, and that's it. And 20 or 30 million, I think it should just be 20 million for refinancing of loans if it meets the 2%, because I don't believe, I wanted to ask Gita whether or not they've applied the 2% savings using the 7%, because I took out the A&Z loan for 2 million, or the committee did, because it didn't meet that 2% at 5.9. At 7%, how many of these other loans would survive that?
Yes, Speaker, we have reviewed all the loan documents, and we do understand the 2% threshold for refinancing, the minimum, and so when we were doing the initial analysis, there was that one that wasn't meeting the 2, but in total, by refinancing all 4, we were able to meet the 2%. But so Alfred, we talked to the port, and going by the individual, the ones that remain do meet the 2%.
You have done the calculation with the 7% interest?
We've done the calculations because we're not extending the amortization of those loans, and so we're paying them off with within the same maturities that they exist. And so when they did the analysis, they were able to achieve the minimum 2%.
Speaker Cruz.
Okay. Well, all right, fine. But as it relates to the amendment that we're currently discussing, I just would like to have the committee, and this is how you guys sent it. I didn't make up those numbers. Those are the numbers that you guys sent us, and we reported it out just as it was sent to us. If there's going to be any effort to try to delete them, then there should at least be a cap on the amount of CIP projects that are going to be used out of this whatever loan amount, bond amount you guys are planning on doing. But there should be some number somewhere.
Speaker Cruz, do you have an amendment to the amendment? Thank you very much, Speaker Cruz. We still have an amendment by Senator Ada. Senator Torres, you're recognized. On the amendment, please.
I just want a point of clarification from Gita. When we use the word approximate amount, generally, what is an approximate? What is the variance on an approximate? And this has to do with the proffer of the amendment's concern that the project could be thrown out, for example, if it doesn't meet the threshold or it exceeds the threshold. So what generally would be an approximate amount?
So the approximate amount is what we use when we don't know the exact amount, as the port directors, general managers stated. We don't know the exact amount, so the approximate amount is this, and we use that kind of like our not to exceed amount for each project.
So not to exceed, that would
Well,
probably, yeah. Because it is, in reading it, it is vague, and it does lead you to think that it could be a variance up or down, and that was why I wanted clarification. But, you know, generally I agree that one of the points here that makes it a little more palatable is when you have CIP projects and figures attached to it, it gives you the reassurance that a certain amount of improvements will be made, you know, amounts that are, improvements that are relevant and necessary, as opposed to having a wide range of, you know, determining whether to do a little or a lot. And so having figures attached to it gives that reassurance that adequate amounts of repair will be made, or relocation or construction. But I think here what tends to be tripping a lot of us up is just whether there should be another way of rewording the amount, as opposed to saying approximate, maybe as other senators have spoken, inserting language such as not to exceed rather than approximate, because it is vague. It gives a semblance of up or down, whereas what we really mean to do is put a cap.
Why don't we first deal with the ADA amendment to completely delete the numbers, and if that passes, then I guess we're done. Otherwise, if it doesn't pass, then this tightening could be the next step. But right now, on the floor, it's the ADA amendment to delete all the numbers.
And to that point, I was making the point that I thought that it would be good to keep them, so I wouldn't be in favor of the amendment. I just went a little too far.
Thank you. On the ADA amendment to delete all the numbers in the capital improvement projects, any other senator wish to be heard? There's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor? Do you wish to close? You can close.
So first of all, if everybody goes to page 285 of the committee report, you'll see an analysis that was done on the projected estimated cost for the administration building, and it provides 4 options. And it breaks down as best as possible the cost of construction, design, construction management, etc. Now, these numbers are not a shot in the dark. Construction companies have a reference that they go to, that if you're going to build a 40,000 square foot building, and you put in some certain variables or whatever, it'll provide you, and that's how they come up with, that's probably whatever whatever factors they put in, that's how they came up with $350 per square foot to construct this administrative building that they're looking at. You'll find that the cost of construction for the EQMR and the warehouse building is different. What factors they put in, I don't know. But my point is that these numbers, these cost estimates, were not something that somebody dreamed of on the way to work. There's actually engineering references that they can resort to. Now, insofar as deleting how much is the cap for a certain CIP project, there's certainly precedent for that. If we take a look at the GPA bond issuances, If we take a look at GWA, it basically says we authorize this amount to do these projects. Now, during the course of the discussion, there was information that was provided that, yeah, to, you know, replace 1,000 feet of water line, 6-inch, and all that stuff, it's going to cost so many hundreds of dollars or whatever per square foot. So there's some rationality to it that will get us into the ballpark. Now, where in the ballpark this cost is going to land is going to depend on a lot of things. What do the bids come out? Maybe the bids come out really nice and low, but as they go through, then there will be change orders. Guarantee there will be change orders. So what do you do when the building is just about finished, 75% done, and they have to come in with change orders because we come across things like, oh my God, we didn't know that there was asbestos in there. So that's additional cost. We didn't know that, you know, putting in the pilings, like what happened here with a museum. It took a little bit more money, and there were change orders there. So those are the variables that we don't really know about. But that's where good engineering comes in, to be able to get a handle on those things. Now, it was suggested that, well, maybe we should go out and first hire the engineering design, okay? And sure, that you cut down a lot of the uncertainty by doing that, because then, you know, we really get a better idea of what it is that we want and all that, and we find that it's starting to get a little expensive. You go in and you do value engineering, and you start cutting back. But sometimes that for the want of greater certainty, the cost, inflation, just the cost of construction keeps going up. So what we saved by trying to get that certainty is just nullified by the increasing cost of construction. Net gain, 0. And finally, you know, I think we've got to give the agencies the benefit, some degree of confidence and benefit of the doubt that, you know, you think you can build all these for 80 million? Well, then here, you have it, but you better be ready to account. If you only come back, if you list 10 CIP projects and you only come back with 3, then you better be able to account for what the heck went wrong and who fell asleep at the wheel. But otherwise, if, you know, we're going to treat them like a bunch of elementary school students, you know, let's move forward. As far as I'm concerned, from a policy standpoint, I don't want you spending more than 80 million or whatever it is. And
I think you should stop using the 80 million. It's 50, please, because
yeah.
I don't want the record to show that we're doing anything about CIPs in 80.
Okay, fine. So that's my piece on that.
There's been an objection. All those in favor of the added amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails.
The floor?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So, earlier after the public hearing, the speaker sent some supplemental questions to the port. And one of the questions, in fact, the question was asked at the public hearing, are you going to go back and recalculate the rate increase that's going to be needed? Because I believe the rate increase that's associated with the 77711% increases was based on undertaking about $45 million of CIP projects, right? And now we're talking about 65, 80, whatever. And your answer, Mr. Dueñas, to that question was, no, you're not going to go back and revisit the rate increase that will be needed. Can you maybe enlighten us as to why you responded that way?
When you look at the bond bill, when we do when we pay off the existing loans, the the debt service for those existing loans would also be used for the retirement of the bond. So you still got your core 40 some odd million. You got the thing that we asked for on the tariff for the interest, the capitalized interest, and for the reserve. Those were already factored into the bond payment. So all we're taking is the debt service for the existing debts, and we'll be using that for the same purpose, debt service towards the bond.
And that's where I have a problem, because I don't see that in writing to show that because we're really not, I mean, you're going to borrow money to pay off that higher interest loan, but you're still going to be paying off that loan.
Right.
So it isn't as if, you know, that's, maybe you have a little bit of money left from the savings, but we're going to go from $40 million, $45 million worth of CIPs, we're going to double that to $80 million, and we're going to still be able to survive with the 77711?
Right, because the debt service that you had for the $20 million loan that you refunded, that debt service would continue to be used for the bond payment.
Well, until I see that in writing, to see actually where the savings are and how the bottom line comes out, I really have difficulty with that. Okay? Now, the other, if I may.
Yes, I was just going to say that I'm happy you asked that question, because I have an amendment to prohibit any rate increase for a number of years, since they're as confident as they are. And I'm hoping that they've planned for 5 years, and if they haven't.
Okay. The other question that I have, and before I go into the other question, let me just, you know, I read through 370 pages of that committee report, right? And a lot of them were testimonies from port employees and whatnot. And I think a good summary of the port's capital improvement needs was best said by one of the employees that was down there. He said, overall, in order for the Port Authority of Guam to better handle and secure all the various ... cargoes, have the best maintenance facility to service and repair all our equipment, to provide a safe and secure working environment, the port needs to expand its footprint and modernize its facilities to meet not only today's demand, but the demand of the future. Another individual from the port said, and I believe this was the general manager's testimony, says, building replacement as opposed to major renovation would be more practical and economical. Throughout the testimonies, safety seemed to be a common thread of the testimonies that were provided by the witnesses. And a final point was that the buildings that we have down there have inadequate capacity to meet today's demands. So for example, the EQMR building that was built 50 years ago was fine for maybe your 2 top picks and how, you know, you could probably count all your equipment on one hand. According to the testimonies, you've probably easily doubled that, right? So the EQMR building as it stands right now is not sufficient, doesn't have the capacity. And so that's probably kind of driving a little bit why you want to relocate that administrative building so that you can give more footprint to the EQMR. But frankly, I'm really concerned about, it's kind of like penny wise, pound foolish. We're going to spend $2 million to do, you can call it repair work, you can call it cosmetic, but you know, it's kind of like, what do you get when you put lipstick on a pig? You still have a pig. You still have a 50-year-old building with rebars that are corroding. Now, I realized that the port made the analysis that we can put a nice paint job and put plaster where the rebars are showing and get away with $2 million. And maybe that will hold us, you know, for the next couple of years. but it's just as old as the administration building that we're going to take down. And I guess the analysis that was made was that, and probably is that for the equipment, the EQMR building, to give it the repair work, it's going to cost $3.6 million. To replace it, it's going to cost $11.3 million. But for $11.3 million, maybe you'll go another 50 years. So where I'm going with this, Mr. Chairman, is that, quite frankly, I'm just not convinced that, you know, slapping on $5 million worth of cosmetic work on these two buildings that's kind of like kicking the can down the road, right? It's like we know that we need, for example, the wharf. What do we do to buy time? We spent $10 million to extend the service life of that wharf. And that was probably good. It got some confidence out of that because you had engineers who were able to kind of project, right, how much it costs. But so, you know, if we were going to actually replace the EQMR building and the warehouse, we're looking at adding another $30 million, which will bring this thing up to 100. But it's an investment that's going to take the port down the road a long ways to meet today's demand as well as tomorrow's demand. And, you know, otherwise, we're just going to get a nice painted building. That's all we're going to get for those two buildings. And it's ironic that the EQMR building, which will cost $11 million to, and I notice you're kind of smirking like, you know, I've been smoking something. You can go ahead and smirk if you want. But it's ironic that the building that we just want to do cosmetic work on is the building that houses some of your most expensive equipment. That's what you said in your own testimony. But it's not worth the money that it takes to replace the building. I think I've said my piece.
Thank you. Senator Dragon, I understand. Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Torres? I mean, Senator Muñoz, and then Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to the Port Authority for being here and to Gita to yield to some of our questions. I think my question is fairly simple. There are a couple of issues that are either unresolved or pending, like the Y2K settlement and the overtime pay dispute. I was wondering if any of these issues will affect the port's credit rating and maybe the ability to get some of the more favorable terms of the bond. That's my question.
I'm sorry, you were saying, could you repeat that?
Yeah, if any of the unresolved issues or pending issues with the port, would it affect the credit rating, the port's credit rating, in obtaining like the most favorable terms of the bond?
When we're going to the rating agencies and they have port specialists, they do look at all of the criteria needed to run each port, standard criteria that they score the port on, and if there are any pending issues, it will affect the credit rating. And you know, I know Guam being, I mean, one of the challenges they have starting off is that Guam is an isolated island, and so you know we're already at a disadvantage, and so we feel though that with everything that the port has put together as far as strengthening their financials and adjusting their capital improvement plan, that you know, we're hoping that we can at least get investment grade rating on this.
Anything further?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was it. Mike.
Senator Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess my question is directed more to Gita, Mrs. Garcia. In looking at Section 3, where there's the appropriation of funds for items 1 through 4, and in items 1 and 2, it has specific amounts attached to it. In appropriating in this manner, does it restrict the bond proceeds to just these items? And my question is in line with looking earlier in the bill at Section 1 on page 36, Section 10220. That section deals with payments which may be made out of the proceeds of the sale of the bonds. And it includes in it some items, for example, certain fees, engineering fees, inspection, legal consultants, bond trustee, escrow agents, or any of the cost or expenses relating to the authorization, issuance, or sale of bonds. So in looking at it, I was just wondering if there's no specific mention of it in Section 3, although it's authorized in another section, is there a need to insert that language in there to provide for those associated costs that are mentioned, for example, in page 36?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We were looking at that as well, and on page 36, you have payments which may be made out of the proceeds of the bonds, and again, these are specific to the bond issuance, and it includes the project list as well as other costs tied to the issuance of bonds. And so I agree with you that we would probably have to, since we're being specific in Section 3, we would probably have to include some of that language in Section 3.
Yeah, I was thinking that because those amounts are quite sizable, right? There's usually a percentage attached to those fees, generally when you have the sale of bonds. Is that correct? So you could almost estimate, if you were going to float bonds in the amount of $70 million, what the associated fees, at least for a portion of that, I mean, notwithstanding engineering fees or any of the other things contained in some of it, but just the general sale of bonds and the different agents attached to it, including Gita, perhaps.
Right. Our placeholder has been that cost of issuance and these non-project related fees, because if you're looking at construction, engineering, those are tied to the project. But the bond fees and costs are normally, if we're looking at a max amount, we are normally at a 2% of bond issuance, but we've always come under that amount as far as the cost of issuance, bond-related costs associated to this. So, you know, it's common to put in a 2% cost of issuance.
Insofar as the other project-related costs, are those generally contained in the amounts that you have? For example, you projected 17.5 for the admin building. Would that be like an all-inclusive estimate so that you wouldn't all project-related costs are then therefore tied into these itemizations? Is that how it generally is? So you wouldn't expect to have other costs outside of the 17.5 wouldn't be strictly construction?
That, Senator, that is my understanding that all of those costs are included.
Okay, yes, thank you. Senator Adder was kind enough to point that out. So if I may suggest, I don't know exactly how the language ought to read, but I would think that in an abundance of caution that we do insert for those provisions so that we do know, at least have an idea of what that net effect will be once we pay out all these non-project and agent-related fees, what the net effect would be on the the capitalization of interest fund and what the reserve fund would be? Because I think that also gives us a sense of what would be a good amount to play with, whether it's maxing it out or scaling back, you know, what you would end up in the end with in those reserved accounts. I mean, what is the most beneficial to the port in the end? Right.
Yeah, yes, I agree with you.
Do you have any further questions?
No, thank you. The only thought that I have is how would we provide that language that would include those non-project costs?
We'll instruct legal to prepare the language for your introduction.
Thank you.
At a later time.
Thank you.
We'll come back to you for that introduction. Did you wish to raise another objection? I mean, another question? Senator Abbott, before I recognize Senator Uggan, he has a couple of amendments. Go ahead. Senator Abbott, did you have, I see your finger going up.
Yeah, going back to our now famous administration building. You're going to basically replace it, but build it in a different location over by where the old, I guess, Seamen's Club was, right? Does the port have jurisdiction of that property? And I ask that only because there may be a hiccup from the standpoint of building a port property or a port piece of asset on property that the port does not have jurisdiction on.
Well, that's a very important point, Senator. We have no intentions of building a port facility on non-port property. We're not talking about the location of the old Seamen's Club. The two locations that were proposed are the areas prior to the current entryway into the yard. We have that property, the portion of it was occupied temporarily with the black construction building at the time when they were building the expanded yard. And the other location is the Booney Yard that's across on the other side of where your test facility is located. Those are the two properties that we're looking at. And again, because the type of ground that we have there, obviously we're going to have to ensure that the ground is stable enough to accommodate a building. As you know, many portions of the property there in Cabras Island was backfilled, so all of those things need to be looked at in terms of proper siting. And then also we need to take into consideration what will be the eventual expansion of the port again. As you've noticed in a 30-year series since the port was originally constructed back in the late 60s, you had the first phase where you had Low Tower was the main access to the yard. And since then, that was during the ad administration, that was the access to the yard 30 years ago. And then a little over 20 years ago, they built the second gatehouse that we since closed 2 years ago. And then now with the federal funding, we have phase 3. I think eventually, there's no doubt, there's going to come a time for phase 4, whether they build F7 or not, just simply in terms of having storage for containers and other things of that nature. You want to ensure the yard remains contiguous to each other for both operational security requirements. So I think eventually there's going to be that ultimate expansion, maybe the next 30 to 40 years. So we would want to look at all those factors to ensure that we're not going to build a building in a place that's going to impact ultimately what our key objective is, and that is, the storage, temporary storage and movement of cargo coming into the port yard. So the location you're talking about was not under consideration, where the location of the old Seamen's Club is, because I understand the old Route 11 that's exterior to our gate is still under the authority of Public Works for access. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, the reason why I asked that question is that if we don't, we probably need to address that sooner than later. And at least the research that the Land Committee has done has found that green space between the port, the easternmost boundary of the port, over to where GPA, that green space belongs to Gov Guam, and it is reserved for port-related purposes, but it is not reserved or under the jurisdiction of the Port Authority of Guam. So there's that's quite a difference, and there are other agencies right now that are looking at grabbing a piece of that. For example, Customs. They need space, probably they're looking at about 2 to 4 acres to build their invasive species customs warehouse. And certainly as, as close to the yard as possible. But, the question of where the admin building is going to be built, that is something that really needs to be better defined, and the necessary paperwork needs to be started to say this comes under the jurisdiction of the Port Authority.
Yes. And Senator, as we did when we had to address the expansion of the yard for the construction of the modernization, I mean, there were portions of Route 11 that actually were consumed by the previous construction of the yard. And we had to address the exchange of property between the port and Government of Guam through DPW. Also, to properly align Route 11, of course, the military spent another $17+ million. They also had to ensure that all of that property was under Gov Guam versus portions that were under the boundary of the port. So it has happened in the past, and I'm sure in order to address the growth and development that we need at the port, there's no problem. We would, if we have to address those issues, we would need to, because there's a very limited, finite amount of property that is available there, and unless you do some major environmental permitting, the odds of expanding that footprint are going to be very difficult and very expensive down the road. So certainly note your comments that you've raised, but and as you were talking about earlier with regards to the expansion of our maintenance facility, because of the finite space we have there, it is necessary to move. And even if you were to demolish and want to construct new warehouse facilities, you're going to have a location to construct that new facility in order to move existing operations, because if we don't have a maintenance facility to operate out of, if we don't have Warehouse 1, where we do have a tenant, we have the crane operation, we have our safety division, our engineering division, plus the covered storage space that we do need for some of our equipment, it would be more helpful, as with the admin building, have another location to construct, and then transfer. Right now in the existing yard, I can't even begin to imagine where you would build such a facility now, and then eventually maybe tear down the existing warehouses to accommodate. So it's one of the reasons removing the admin building out of that area, expanding the maintenance property, then you can construct a new facility, and eventually, yes, you are right, we're just buying a little time so that you can go ahead and construct a new facility, have a property to install that in, and then go back and perhaps demolish. Because I think down the road, probably Warehouse 1, as with Warehouse 2, because they are so close to the wharf, we don't require, break bulk cargo like it used to be, where it was uncovered and required immediate storage. Down the road, those are probably facilities that can be scaled back and taken back away from the wharf, so you have more direct accessibility for the movement of cargo. But again, the need for space is critical, and how we use the finite space down there. I understand Customs has a need, but at the same time, the port has no other home. It would only make sense that its operations and facilities be as close as possible to the port yard.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would just like to proffer two very simple amendments. Not complicated at all. On section 3, page 45, there's regarding the EQMR building. Oh yeah. 1, 2, 3. Line 3 on page 46. That's a CIP, just the description of the CIP projects is to repair the equipment, maintenance, and repair building. And throughout the testimonies, you find that they talk about they need to expand also. And so we probably really should be more precise and put the amendment in there, repair and expansion. Whatever expenditure needs to be made to expand the footprint, whether it be just to put asphalt or whatever, but at least that's precise. If I'm correct, that's probably, we don't want to just repair the building, but we also need to expand the footprint of the EQMR operations. So I think the language would be appropriate to put in there repair and expansion of the EQMR.
There's an added amendment to amend line 3 on page 46 to repair and expand. Senator San Nicolas. Any other senator after Senator San Nicolas? Senator Snickfish, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciated the line of questioning from the mover of the amendment with respect to the repair language that's used in these sections here. And in this particular amendment that he's proffering, in order to add the word expansion, I wanted to first ask, this planned repair of the EQMR building, the Equipment Maintenance and Repair Building, what is the projected useful life of the building after the repairs are completed?
We've guesstimated it can be another 15 to 20 years.
15 to 20 years. And the debt that is planned for this repair is going to have a maturity of when?
Or 30 years from now.
2048.
2048. I'm sorry, I'm very bad like that. That's 2017 right now. 30 years, if it floats in 2018. So we're going to borrow, and so and if I may ask Gita, I'm sure you have your bond calculators handy, the 3.6 million at a 6.5% interest rate over 30 years is going to amount to, what's the total in principal and interest?
I'm sorry, I don't have the number.
Okay, I knew I should have just pulled mine up. Anyway, 6.5% at 3.6 million. $234,000 in interest a year times 30 years. About $7 million in interest. It's always about double or triple, plus 3,600,000. Just give or take, this will total interest and principal will be about $10 million for this repair. But what happens at the 15-year mark? If we repair the building and we expand it, and then at the 15-year mark, it's no longer usable, we're still going to have to pay for this debt and this debt service. We would have increased the tariffs, but it would have only gotten us halfway through the actual debt, and the useful life of the asset would need to be the asset would either need to be retired or repaired again at that time. A new bond would probably need to be floated. A new tariff would have to be raised to pay for that. So I understand the expansion language with respect to the testimony, but even if we repair and expand an asset, even if those expansions are part of a building that's going to run its course after 15 years, are we basically setting ourselves up to pay for something that's not going to last as long as the debt is going to last? I mean, it's like taking out a mortgage to build a house, a 30-year mortgage, but the house is only going to last 15 years. So in line with that line of questioning from the retiring speaker who actually raised this point and raised a very good point, should we be repairing and expanding for a useful life of 15 to 20 years with a debt of 30 years, or should we perhaps reconsider the plan altogether and try to make sure that we're matching the useful life of the asset with the actual duration of the debt?
May I respond? Okay, so when we start working on the financial structure, we have a number of special bond counsel will look at it, look at the asset and the life and everything, and our proposal here that we've been talking to court was debt 25 to 30 years. 25 to 30 years, so we're not set on 30. We could start at 25, and it all depends on the financial analysis and tax review that's going on. And so, we're looking at the total amount secured by port revenues, and and then the useful life of the asset is looked at. So, we'll have to wait for that analysis, but right now, it looks like we're looking between 25 and 30-year debt for this, is what we're qualified for.
And I appreciated the retiring speaker bringing this up, because when you go down the line here, everything is repair, repair, repair. The only replacement is actually the admin building. And I haven't even asked the question of what the useful life will be for these other assets that are only being repaired. And I just, I'm just speaking philosophically. I've always just been the type who wants to always match the debt to the asset at least 1-to-1, preferably 2-to-1 if you can. I mean, you take out a 5-year car loan, the car's supposed to last you 10 years. You pay it off after 5, you're still able to drive it. You take out a 30-year house loan, the house should at least last you 30 years. But here we're going to be taking out these bonds, raising the tariffs to pay for them, to pay for capital improvements that are going to basically run their course, and the bonds are still going to be owed for almost twice as long as the assets would have been made more useful. Very concerning.
But if I may, the bonds that GovGuam has been floating for this, as well as from previous bonds, a lot of it has been secured by the revenues of the authority and not set like a mortgage or a car loan. So again, that's where they're not, the bondholders, I suppose, are not getting into, what are you, will the asset you're building last for 30 years? They're looking at, based on the tax analysis of what can qualify, and on the credit review, you can sustain a 30-year debt, as opposed to if you foreclose or you're not able to pay your debt, we're not going to foreclose on the port building, on this admin building or that. Their security is in the revenues of the port.
No, I understand. There's no bondholder who's going to seize any assets. Actually, the risk is the opposite. The ratepayer on the tariff is going to be paying for a warehouse after it's no longer usable. The warehouse would be usable for 15 years. I'm sorry, the EQMR building. There's a warehouse here too, but we're talking about the EQMR building on the amendment. That building will only be useful for 15 years, but the ratepayer is going to continue paying for the bond that financed it 15 years after it's already exhausted its useful life. So, I'm very hesitant to want to move forward long-term debt that people are going to be paying for after the asset's no longer usable. And it's almost like capitalized interest in reverse. We take capitalized interest because it's under construction, we're not using the asset anymore, let's push it forward. But then if we're not using the asset after 15 years, then we're paying for the debt 15 years after that. I mean, that just doesn't sound very wise at all to me. So, while the mover of the amendment is correct, if the testimony does speak towards expansion, we should consider that. I think that at this juncture, given the fact that the asset's useful life is 50% of what the debt duration will be, we really should reconsider altogether whether repairing is the route to take, or whether we should come back to the drawing board and figure out how to make investments that are going to last for at least the duration of the debt service that the people of Guam are going to be paying for, and the higher cost of goods coming through their port. So in that vein, I'll just need to object to the amendment. And Mr. Speaker, I know I spoke earlier, but as we come back maybe for round 2, I'd like to bookmark this as a potential other item for me to discuss at a later time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Can we provide a comment? If you wish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do want to comment because I understand the logic of some of the positions that have been made, but let me give you the alternative of where we're at here at the Port of Guam. And I know we provided the opportunity for all members of the current legislature to come down and tour the port. I don't know if some of you have, some of you have not. Some of you may be a little more familiar with port operations, some of you may not. We have physical constraints in terms of the space that we have, and I would love to build new warehouse facilities. I would love to rebuild the entire wharf that has a $100 million plus price tag. Our objective is to try to address, yes, the repair facilities that unfortunately for many, many, many years have not been maintained. That's a sad reality. How or why, I can't answer. I can't answer for anything beyond the time I've been there. But in order to expand that timeline available, we do have to address the repairs of those facilities. That is the most practical thing that we need to do, because I do not have a current footprint right now with the existing design and structures that are there to relocate a new warehouse for maintenance that is adjacent to the yard and readily accessible, so that equipment, as it's coming in to be repaired, has a location. Back in the day, in the 1960s, top lifters were not envisioned. Containerized cargo was not the standard. The sizes of those equipment, the location and place that they need to be stored and maintained are quite significant. We don't have any additional footprint that's been added to accommodate that. At the end of the day, if we don't address these repairs, Senators, and I can only be as direct as I always am, if we do not address these repairs today, if you choose not to pass this bond bill, while we're figuring it all out, you know, the process and the infrastructure there is in a dire situation. We have employees that are working in maintenance facilities that are worried about chunks of concrete falling on their head. I have no place right now, unless we remove the administration building, to construct a sizable warehouse. I have nowhere else in the yard to do that. I have nowhere else in the yard to do that. If you're not familiar with the yard, maybe you've seen some drawings, but I have nowhere else to do that. And yet, while we're figuring all these issues out, there's the issue of the day-to-day commerce of containers and other supplies, and pretty much probably everything we've touched in the room, all the way down to the clothes we wear, that come through the Port of Guam. And we need to prioritize ensuring that we have the continual flow of commerce. It's not a perfect situation. It's very hard to come back all these years later and try to address repairs of facilities that were never prioritized to begin with. Our desire is to address, yes, the repairs of these facilities so that we can have them safe and operational and functional, so we continue to do the things that we do. And then that buys additional time so that these other upgrades and improvements or expansions, with the removal of the admin building, which to me is the most feasible, because the actual backside of EQMR is the parking lot and the admin building. You need time to do that. You could give us $50 million and say, go build 2 new warehouses. I can only ask you where. Where can we locate it so it's functional and connected to the yard? So I understand all the little issues. I understand the positioning to the public. I mean, I am a consumer. I will have to pay this like anyone else out there, as everyone that works at the port will have to pay the additional cost. I mean, private carriers can send you a press release and upgrade their rates. There's no public discussion. But because we're a public facility, it's necessary that we go through this. But please keep that in mind at the end of the day. These are things that were not done for many years, and if they're not addressed, we're going to have the continued deterioration of our ability to provide commercial service in this community. That's the reality. That water line, if it is not replaced, okay, we'll patch it. That's what we've been doing. We've been patching. And when a water leak happens there, we're not talking about a few feet in the ground. We're talking about huge crevices that are sometimes not discovered until the asphalt collapses. Can you imagine how much tonnage a top lifter has driving on top of that asphalt and the ground collapses underneath it? These are not hypothetical issues. These are day-to-day realities that our workers out there deal with. Also, the other real possibility as a regulated facility, the Coast Guard shuts us down, which they have the total jurisdiction and authority to do because we cannot meet basic requirements that are needed to operate the port. That's the other reality. I mean, we can sit and wait till it happens. It will happen. So I understand all the, the concerns that are raised, but at the end of the day, if we don't address the practical needs that are there, to address the upgrades and repairs that are needed, to plan for a future that unfortunately was not addressed previously. If we don't upgrade these facilities, ladies and gentlemen, where are you going to be? Where is the people of Guam going to be when they don't get the things that they need to live their day-to-day lives? That's the reality. So it's not an intent to be financially or fiscally irresponsible with anyone's finances. But for those of you that don't have familiarity with the port, have not been down there, have not seen these facilities and the conditions that our people have to work in, I encourage you still, this is the upteenth invitation, please come down. We will give you a personal tour so that you can see the realities of what we have to deal with. Because if we don't address it, if we don't start addressing it now, it will continue to deteriorate. And once we lose that capacity for any period of time to provide resources to this community and the adjacent neighboring islands in Micronesia, a couple 100,000 other people in the region that we support with both food commodities and everything else down to fuel, we're not that far away from that. We're not that far away from the collapse of Gulf Pier, that Mobil provides the fuel that comes out into this community every day. So I understand the positioning and, the port's being irresponsible. My gosh, this day has been too long in coming. So I hope we get your support on these issues. I mean, I understand there's these details we want to get into, but at the end of the day, I hope we don't lose sight of the bigger picture of the concern here, because if we don't, you make my job easier. I don't have to worry about implementing any of this. But the reality is the continued deterioration of the facility is catching up with us. And if we don't address it, there's safety issues, there's regulatory issues, and ultimately the inability to properly service this community to the level of expectation that our business sector, as well as our consumers out there, expect of us.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just wanted to continue the discussion a little bit more about what I brought up.
Please.
I don't think that there's anybody here intending to neglect what needs to be addressed. I think that what we're trying to do is figure out the best way to address that. And so I remember in the discussion earlier, it was brought up that the tariff increase has already been instituted, and it's in year one at 7%. Is that correct? Now, that tariff increase was intended to be able to pay for the debt service. That's also correct?
For debt service, for the capitalized interest, for the debt reserve.
Right.
And other parts that are involved in the operation of the port.
Now, the way the capitalized interest works is we basically borrow the first X number of years worth of debt service in the beginning, and we basically don't have to make any payments on that. But if the tariff increase is already in effect, we're going to be having that cash flow, but it's not going to be necessarily used to pay down the debt at that time because the interest would have been capitalized at the beginning. And so if the tariff increase is already in place, but we're going to be capitalizing the interest for 2 years, then that's 2 years worth of debt service that's actually hard cash that could be used for another purpose. Based on my calculations, at a 6.5% interest rate, that cash flow will generate about $4.5 million a year. And so if we capitalize the interest for 2 years, that's $9 million in cash flow that the port's going to be getting from just the 1 year tariff increase. Now, I understand next year it goes up another 7%?
Yes, sir.
So we could fund these things over 2 years. $4.5 million times 2 is $9 million. The repair to the EQMR is 3.6. The repair to Warehouse 1 is $2 million. The repair to Gulf Pier is $2 million. That's only $7.6 million. So if we capitalize the interest up front for 2 years, and we're still bringing in the cash flow from the tariff increase that's already in effect, we will be bringing in $9 million in cash flow that can go and pay for those repairs without us having to actually borrow for them. So we could actually reduce the debt by the $7.6 million, pay with cash those repairs, not worry about the useful life issue because it would have been funded up front with the cash flow and not be funded by debt service, reduce the amount that we need to borrow, reduce the interest expense that we're going to incur, and basically fit the entire project into the infrastructure that we're already kind of building around all of this. Because if we don't do this, if we do capitalize the interest in the beginning, but the tariff increase is already effective today, we're going to be having additional tariff money coming in, but it won't be necessary to service debt because that debt service would have been capitalized through the Cap-I. So can we, if we're going to be using Cap-I for the first couple of years, and if the tariff increase is already in effect, can we use that tariff increase to pay for these repairs without us having to borrow to pay for it?
Sir, when we first submitted our proposal of $1 million for EQMR, we had planned on using our facility maintenance fund to repair the remaining part of EQMR and of Warehouse 1. We had not planned on borrowing it, but at the urging of some of your colleagues, they indicated, why don't you just put it all in one package and get it all done at one time? But if you go back to our prior year capital improvement projects, the repair of EQMR was there to be funded by the Facilities Maintenance Fund. Now, as far as capitalized interest is concerned, we would be generating a sufficient cash flow to take care of the interest as it's paid, as it's due. The interest on the initial first 2 years is pretty much based on the drawdown, not on the 80 million. It's how much you take out. That's what you pay interest on. I'm only asking, or we're asking for capitalized interest in the event that something happens in the next 2 years that may force us to use the funds for other purposes. We have the fallback of the capitalized interest. But technically, as far as the capitalized interest for the first 2 years, we most likely can do that using our own source of revenue, not just the set aside from the tariff increase, but the revenues that we're having because of increase of volume of containers coming in.
I very much appreciate you sharing that with us, sir, because, I mean, if we can do that, that would be more ideal. I mean, borrowing a 30-year bond for a building that's only going to last 15 years when we actually could use our cash flow to pay for it, I think that would be more preferable. And if we can do that for all of these other repair items, then you'll find a fan in me for capitalizing. I'm a big hater in capitalized interest. I'm like, why are we doing that? But if we can do it for this, if we can capitalize the interest on this bond in order for us to use the cash flow for those first 2 years to pay for these repairs so we don't need to include it in the debt, you get a thumbs up from me on that. So again, I gotta credit the retiring speaker for calling attention to this issue, because it I kind of didn't catch it, but this is something I think that we should really discuss further, Mr. Chairman, as Chair of Appropriations. I think that this is something that we should, as a body, consider. If we're going to be doing the capitalized interest for the first 2 years, and if the tariff increase is already effective, then let's reprogram that tariff increase cash flow to pay for these repairs and reduce the amount that we need to borrow for the overall project. Just a very serious point that I'd like to raise at the time of this discussion, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
May I make one point? If I just may, and again, just regarding capitalized interest, it's always about the cost of money. And I agree with you that, borrowing to pay the first year doesn't make sense. But if you borrow at a really low interest rate, then the cost is a lot cheaper than having to pay it out of your pocket. And so that's part of the analysis that we go through. We may have to pay, in your discussion, $8 million for 2 years of capitalized interest, but we only have to set aside 7.6 or 7.7 because, we can put that in, it's held, there's a little bit of interest earned, and then when we pay it. So that's kind of how capitalized interest could work for us. And then, but it's true, you're borrowing money to pay.
I just recall whenever we had the capitalized interest discussions of GPA or GWA, the argument that was always given to us was this will prevent us from having to increase rates right now. We capitalize the interest for GPA or GWA, we don't have to increase the rates. But what I'm hearing is that the tariffs have already been increased. If the tariffs have already been increased and we're going to be doing the capitalized interest, we already raised the rate. So instead of having that raised rate go into some fund or some savings account, let's use that to pay for the repairs so we don't need to borrow as much upfront. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, yeah, we're still on his amendment, which I think you objected to, right? Did you wish to speak to the ad amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple questions about the expansion for the EQMR. I think you stated that there was a life on the building of 15 years. Could you just describe the concept of the expansion? So as I'm understanding it, you have 5 top loaders, and you said you have 2 bays currently. So I'm assuming that the expansion would be for additional bays to house and repair this equipment?
I think initially what will happen, assuming that we are able to take down the administration building, is opening up that section to the yard and enclosing it, because what we need is space right now just to also store our equipment. We currently have 7 operational top lifters with the hope of getting another 2 to 3, maybe, depending on the price, 4 out of the remaining $50 million from DOD and MERIT to purchase additional capacity. That also includes, we just recently purchased 16 new tractors, a number of 20-ton, 10-ton, 5-ton forklifts. So that'll allow us additional space, and that'll also give time eventually in the next few years to begin funding or designing an additional warehouse facility, because we believe in order to move forward with eventual demolition, that could be 15, it could be 20, it could be 25 years, depending on what additional upgrades and improvements may be put in place down the road, that will allow a new facility to be constructed. And if and when that, I should say when the time comes for the existing warehouse one or the existing EQMR building to be taken down, there's additional property space available for buildings to already be constructed to replace them, because what we can't do is tear down the existing facility and have nowhere to go in the interim.
And I guess that's what I'm just trying to clarify. So with the expansion and the upgrades you want to do, because it seems like almost 2 different projects, right? We're going to expand, which means we're going to open it up within the current footprint when you move.
Assuming that property can be opened up,
Yeah.
That is the desire, because it makes the most sense. It's the closest to the existing operations. It's most functional for the port yard. That is one of the main desires, to relocate the admin building so that we can expand the yard, because there's very little other real estate around us that we can do that. There really, I can only where there is no other space right now that we can expand.
But that would be different from the repairs to the current EQMR.
No,
building.
and the repairs to EQMR are, and it was brought up. I do want to add, and the issue with the admin building. We are able to receive in other areas other grants, and the port has been very good about facilitating other grant opportunities and ensure that we properly administer those grants and account for them. We do very well. To get a Tiger grant nationally at that amount is, I think, attests to the exceptional ability of our planning division and our staff to accomplish that. And so we are able to get other funding. For example, what's not included in the proposal for Warehouse 1 and EQMR are the replacement of the bay doors. I mean, those are sizable doors. They all have to be replaced, but we just recently received $75,000 to secure the crane shop that's at the far end of Warehouse 1. And we are also pursuing additional federal funding so that we can replace all the bay doors throughout both of those facilities. We have our facilities maintenance fee, as Mr. Duenas had commented on, that generates about $1 million a year. We are restricted to ensuring that money can only be used in the yard for cargo-related support. So that is what allows us, and we have done renovations to low tower, high tower, and these are the work facilities of our people out in the yard. Again, facilities that had not been upgraded or improved in close to 50 years. So there are other sources that we can work on to assist in this, because this is not the beginning or end. 3.6 is not the end of the price tag to EQMR, but we have other options that we can pursue in funding that will support that. Unlike, for example, an admin facility, you're not going to get a grant or federal support to rebuild an admin facility.
Well, the EQMR, or at least the expansion, could potentially, depending on the engineering of it, could potentially have a longer lifespan than the actual EQMR building currently, because we're almost talking about 2 different projects, really.
Well, we're talking right now about rehabilitating the existing facility, which has a significant lifespan. In the real world, it's a significant lifespan that we need to extend.
Okay, so no current expansion under the proposed amendment?
Except for ground space, which is what we need. The most immediate benefit that we will gain, assuming we are able to take down the existing admin facility, is the additional space that will be available to consolidate port equipment adjacent to the EQMR facility, with the eventual opportunity to build a new facility in that property for those 4 EQMR But that is something that, again, will happen down the road. The main thing is acquiring the property for that purpose, which we don't readily have available right now, while the admin facility is sitting there with the parking lot.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Senator Espaldon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we're right now on an amendment just to add the word "and expand." That's all this discussion really started with, and we've got to this point. By adding those two words, repair and expand, or expansion of the EQMR in the approximate amount of $3.6 million, by adding that word expansion, is the amount still appropriate at $3.6 million? Because without that word, without the amendment, it would be just the repair at $3.6 million. And so by adding that word, expansion, do we need now to expand the amount of $3.6 million?
Who wishes to address that? Do you wish to address it?
Or, well, I'd like to ask the PORC that, because I'm not sure what their understanding might be, or maybe even the mover of the amendment, what expansion means in this context of the EQMR building.
In terms of the current funding that's been identified, including the increase, the additional 2.628 increase to this, what it will address is, one, the spalling repairs that do need to be done, there are roof repairs and cracks that need to be addressed. After the public hearing, we went back and included what we otherwise would have done over time to phase in. That's the plus and minus. If we are able to get more of this funding up front, we can do it simultaneously versus phasing it out over another 3 to 5 years to essentially rebuild the existing office spaces that are located. And these are office space, for example, for maintenance, for crane shops, for our safety division that we're currently doing now. The buildings that are inside the warehouses, if you've been there, they are essentially, some of the facilities are former fishery offices that were built.
Are we talking about just the EQMR building?
Right now, just EQMR, yes.
Right, okay.
The office spaces, and there's nothing luxurious, but these are where the mechanics work and operate out of. Again, they're makeshift wooden structures that, in most cases, after looking at our existing refurbishment of the safety and engineering division, more than likely are not up to code.
Right.
Because they were simply makeshift and built, and when the fishing companies, for example, Warehouse 1 phased out, port employees in those divisions took over those spaces.
Wasn't that contemplated in $3.6 million? Because that goes to the essence of my question.
Since the public hearing and the recommendations that we received from your colleagues at this particular hearing, we went back and included the cost of what it would be to essentially refurbish all those spaces, including to make it more functional so that existing areas that we need to have additional open space in the warehouse for operations, maintenance, and things of that nature, we can remove existing makeshift wooden offices and locate them and build them up into the structure so that it maximizes the space for operations and maintenance that actually need to occur. And with this funds, if we got them up front, it would allow us to go in and essentially get all that done, because the odds are fairly good. None of those things were built to code. They were not professionally constructed. They built with what they had and what they were able to work with, and that's what they've been housed in. But in terms of their break facilities, their restroom facilities, their shower facilities, senators, if you have not been down there, most of you have not. Most of you are not intimately familiar with the realities that these men and women work in every day. They're not anything you or I on a daily basis probably would want to spend our time in. But if we are able to address these upgrades and improvements, then we have a safe, functional environment for people that work harder than you and I every day to go out and do the repairs.
Senator, so bottom line is I'm taking it that the answer to my question coming from you is that by adding the two words to this section D, repair and expansion of the EQMR, bottom line, the $3.6 million will cover not only the repair, but an expansion as well.
No, the 3.6 pretty much will cover the current footprint of EQMR building. The expansion we're talking about is if the admin is taken down, is the actual ground space that we need to store the equipment.
Okay, so If I may, Mr. Chair, then, it seems to me that if we do add, since we're addressing the amendment before us right now to include 2 words and expansion, then we would then also now have to consider the increase in the budgetary amount that, that should be considered for not just the repair, but the expansion as well. And if I'm misspeaking or if I'm wrong, please correct me. I mean, that's what I'm understanding.
It stands to reason, but the mover of the amendment wishes to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, you know, I think if there's expansion that can be had, it's going to have to come from whatever surplus comes from another project. If we give them that flexibility, that, you know, maybe you're able to complete a project for $500,000, then you use it at another project to enhance the EQMR capacity issues and whatnot. And that's why I made that amendment initially so to give them maximum flexibility.
Mr. Chair.
That boat left and sank, and so we're moving forward.
Right. You know, I mean, that would then necessitate us, if we do approve this amendment, to perhaps revisit, almost a notwithstanding clause or the vote on the previous. And we don't want to go there.
That one.
Right. We're not there. But I mean, I'm just trying to, again, in addressing this specific amendment before us by adding the 2 words, then all of a sudden that funding source of 3.6 may no longer be acceptable, because if we start talking about expansion, more money would be needed to accommodate the expansion.
Okay. Do you wish to close, Senator Atta, or does anybody else wish to speak on your amendment? There's been an objection. All those in favor of the Atta amendment to add 2 words and expand? All those in favor? Motion carries.
I've got one more simple amendment.
The motion carried.
Okay.
Yes.
I got one more simple amendment.
Well, okay.
On page 46, line 1, regarding the water lines. And so, as was discussed at the public hearing, the water lines are so old that it can't withstand the pressure that needs to be carried. And so what you really need to do is replace the water line. So again, we're talking about being precise with the language here, because you're going to get some bright young lawyers going to say, no, you can only relocate it, but you can't replace it. So let's be precise about what we're saying, and what we really want to do is replace and relocate the water lines. And there is a difference, because they do want to relocate it, but you need to also replace it, probably for a bigger line and one that can hold the pressure. So my amendment would be on line 1 to start that sentence with replacement and relocation of water lines.
Did you just want to leave it in that order, or would you like to move it to the top, since you're talking about how the water lines can't possibly survive?
Oh, the prioritization of it, we'll leave that up to the port to take care of that. I don't think the projects are listed in an order, any order of, well, actually they are, because when you take a look at when they're going to fund projects, this project's not going to be funded until 2019, according to the information provided by the port.
But it's creating huge crevices in the ground that top lifters are falling into.
Well, that's the information provided by the port, that the water line's not going to be.
All right, so the amendment by Senator Atta is to replace and relocate the water lines on line 1. Any objection? Any objection? Senator
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I did ask initially for a recess, but just in an effort to continue our dialogue, there were a couple of concerns that were brought up a little earlier, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to address them in two separate amendments. The first one has already been circulated, and it would add a new paragraph on page 37, line 10, to add the following phrase: nothing in this article shall authorize the use of bond proceeds for the payment of any settlement or other final disposition in connection with any litigation or action involving the authority or any costs or fees related thereto. Mr. Speaker, you did bring up an issue with regards to ongoing litigation, and certainly we want to clarify the language in this proposed bond issuance that the proceeds would specifically be utilized for the items identified. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and colleagues, I ask for your support.
On this Uggan amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Vice Speaker, and then Senator Nicholas, and then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the amendment. I would move to amend that amendment by changing the words "nothing in this article shall authorize the use of" to say the Port Authority of Guam and every other entity is prohibited from using bond proceeds for the payment of any settlement or final disposition. Because this says that nothing in this article authorizes it, but it may still be allowed by some other, I don't know. I actually would also like to add in the words after bond proceeds or assets of the port built or enhanced by bond proceeds. But
why don't we take a recess and you write that whole thing? Thank you. Legislature's back in order. Vice Speaker, I understand.
Yes, I'd like to withdraw my amendment to that amendment, Mr. Speaker.
All right, thank you. Senator Agon, do I understand that you're going to be amending your amendment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, based on the original amendment that was proffered, I'd like to withdraw that amendment and proffer another version. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This version has been circulated to the members of the body, and the verbiage would read, the authority is prohibited from using bond proceeds, tariffs, or assets of the authority, built or enhanced by said bond proceeds for the payment of any settlement or other final disposition in connection with any litigation or action involving the authority, including any damages, costs, or fees related thereto. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the acceptance of this amendment. Thank you.
The amendment's been circulated. Any senator wish to be heard on this amendment? Senator Lee, then Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a quick question for the mover of this amendment. It indicates beginning on line 10, page 47. So would this be part of section 3, or would this be a new section 4?
It would be a new section 3, or I'm sorry, new section 4. So section 4 now, the title validity would move downward to section 5 and renumber the subsequent sections. So this would be a new section 4.
Understood.
Like was stated. Thank you.
Thank
Senator.
you.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the language of the amendment. There's one particular part of the amendment here that kind of leaves it open in that on the second line it reads, built or enhanced by said bond proceeds. That particular portion of this amendment basically would prohibit anything that's funded by this bill to be used for the litigation, damages, costs, or fees. If we take out that particular part of the amendment, then it would apply to every asset of the authority, not just those that are funded by the bond. It reads, the authority is prohibited from using bond proceeds, tariffs, or assets of the authority built or enhanced by said bond proceeds. If we take that part out, then basically the authority will be prohibited from using bond proceeds, tariffs, or assets, period. With this language still here, assets that exist in the port that were not funded, built or enhanced by bond proceeds, could still be used to retire the litigation, including damages, costs, or fees related thereto. So I'm not quite sure how the votes will turn out on this, but I would like to make a motion to amend the amendment and strike after the word authority the words built or enhanced by said bond proceeds.
My only caution to all the members is that with the legislative history, whether or not the removal of the word bond proceeds would or could be interpreted by the court as being intentional by this body. And as I had pointed out to legal counsel, there was an earlier Supreme Court opinion that really went through our legislative history, and I wanted us to be very careful about how we make our proposals and how we word our amendments, because of how legislative history will be interpreted by the court and what the intended or unintended consequences of this deletion is going to be. But I'm just concerned that we may need to get clearance from legislative counsel as to the effect of your amendment. Why don't you get legislative counsel's opinion on that? What I'd like to do at this point is to ask somebody to please, if we could make a motion. We need to get 209 out before tomorrow morning's court hearing. So I'd like someone to move that we go, get back into that so we can pass it and then we can come back to this. I don't care if we stay till 8 or 9 o'clock tonight to work on this. I just need to get that 1209 out so that the district court stops holding us over the barrel. All right, let's take a short recess.
Can we then dismiss the panel, Mr. Speaker, until tomorrow morning? I mean, just so they don't have to wait around for all of that.
All we're doing is voting on 209, and then we can come back to this in a few minutes. And then we can decide how late we're going to be. But I just need to get that clear. I'm tired of all the headlines about us not moving. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to, notwithstanding the House rules, that the body rise with everything intact. We revert as a body to third reading file to act on bill number 209-34 and then immediately revert back to the committee on the whole.
All right, on that motion, any objection? Legislature's back in order. We're in the voting file. The only bill that's in the voting file at this point is Bill 209. Roll call. Yes, read the title and roll call.
Bill number 209-34, COR, as substituted and amended on the floor, introduced by Thomas C. Atta, B.J.F. Cruz, James V. Espadon. An act to amend Section 1FF of Chapter 5, Public Law 34-42, and to amend Sections 51A-110, 51A-111, and 51A-117, all of Chapter 51A, Title 10, Guam Code Annotated, relative to appropriating funds from the Solid Waste Operations Fund to the Guam Solid Waste Authority, GSWA, for its operations in fiscal year 2018, and the creation of a GWSA comptroller position.
Roll call.
Senator Atta. Senator Atta, aye. Senator Uggan. Senator Uggan, aye. Senator Castro. Senator Castro, aye. Speaker Cruz. Speaker Cruz, aye. Senator Espadon. Senator Espadon, aye. Senator Esteves. Senator Esteves, aye. Senator Lee. Senator Lee, aye. Senator Morrison. Senator Morrison, aye. Senator Muña. Senator Muña, aye. Senator Nelson. Senator Nelson, aye. Senator Rodriguez. Senator Rodriguez, absent, excused. Senator San Augustine. Senator San Augustine, aye. Senator San Nicolas. Senator San Nicolas, pass. Vice Speaker Terlahi. Vice Speaker Terlahi, aye. Senator Torres. Senator Torres, aye. Senator San Nicolas. Senator San Nicolas, pass. Senator San Nicolas. Senator San Nicolas, aye.
Bill 209-34 COR received 14 aye votes, 1 absent excused vote. Bill 209-34 has been duly passed by this body. Thank you. On the motion to go back, on the motion to revert back to second reading, file, and go into the back to the committee of the whole, there being no objection. The legislature is back in the committee of the whole. I believe when we broke, we were on the Uggan Amendment. Anybody else wish to be heard on the Uggan Amendment? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As per a consultation of legal counsel, unless I'm mistaken, they informed me that the recommended amendment to the amendment that I proffered would not pose the risks that you mentioned earlier. So it's sound.
All right.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
If I may. Prior to breaking, we were, I believe, entertaining the Vice Speaker and her intent to make an amendment on the language. I mean, she was, we're talking about...
No, she would do hers.
Oh, she withdrew it?
Yeah, she would do hers,
okay.
And they joined together with Senator Uggan for this amendment, and now Senator Nicholas, before we broke, wanted to delete on bond proceeds.
Okay, I haven't seen the separate amendment yet. Oh, here it is, hidden under... Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. All right.
Before we broke, on line 2, Senator Nicholas is suggesting that, or moving and said bond proceeds. Is that correct? No?
Built or enhanced by said bond proceeds.
I'm sorry. It's to strike from the word built or enhanced by said bond proceeds. So all 7 words are struck. Any senator wish to be heard on this Nicholas amendment to the Uggan amendment? Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to make sense of the ramifications of this amendment. I understand that we would want to prohibit the use of these specific bond proceeds for other than the capital improvement projects identified in the bill, the refinancing of the loans, a capitalized interest fund, and a debt service fund. What concerns me about, just in the initial read of this, is when we have the mention of tariffs or assets of the authority, that then prohibits, unless I am wrong, and please correct me if my feel of this is wrong, that would prohibit any payment of any settlement or other final disposition in connection with any litigation or action involving the authority. Mr. Speaker, I know that there was mention earlier about the sensitivity and the suspicion that this might be used to settle one of the most contentious awards that came down as a result of an arbitration award. But I also am aware that there are other matters before the courts that involve overtime pay to employees that's being litigated before the courts now, and as well as matters in connection with Civil Service Commission and appeals that have been taken also to the court. So does this language, Mr. Speaker, then extend to any and all settlements, because if we do so, then what we're essentially doing, in my estimate, is we're forcing the ports into a position of being in contempt of any awards or any judgments that are ordered against it by the courts or in any arbitration panel. And I just want to be clear, because that, I can't see that that could be a lawful thing for us to do, to say that forever, when you start assigning assets of the authority, that's a very broad thing. And so I would, please clarify me if I'm misreading this, but it just seems quite alarming.
You are not misreading it. Yes, all the Civil Service Commission cases, all of the other things that are currently before the court might or could be precluded, and legal counsel has asked for additional time to review this amendment in light of Supreme and Superior Court decisions, and so we'll break until 10 tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow morning so we can clear this one. There's plenty of other amendments.